The morning the first frost came to Ashwell Park, Nora Vane was on her knees in the muniment room, and the Duke of Ashwell was watching her from the doorway. He had not intended to watch. He had come for the bound ledger his steward had misplaced, and he had found instead a young woman in a plain gray dress, with ink on her left forefinger, kneeling before a spread of estate maps so large they nearly covered the stone floor. She had not heard him enter. The outer corridor was long and the door was heavy, and her attention was given entirely to the vellum before her, to the fine ink lines that described in minute detail the rivers and tracks and field boundaries of 1,200 acres she had never been permitted to own a single inch of. "That boundary," she said aloud, though she was alone, or believed herself alone. Her finger hovered over the westernmost edge of the map. "That is not right." She reached for the small brass rule she had laid at the margin, measured, and measured again. Edmund Ashwell, the 6th Duke of Ashwell, stood very still. He had been told, 3 hours prior, by his butler of 20 years, that the matter of the Western surveys was impossible, that the discrepancy in the maps had been present since his grandfather's time, that no man of any training had been able to reconcile the old field lines with the actual ground. But the question should be put to rest and the eastern drainage project should proceed as planned, since the western acres had always been unmanageable anyway. The woman on the floor of his muniment room measured the line a third time. She set the rule down with a quiet click and reached for a pencil and began to write in a margin that had been blank for 60 years. Edmund Ashwell did not move from the doorway until she had finished. She was, he would learn, a chambermaid. She had been at Ashwell Park for 6 weeks. Her name, he would not learn for some time yet, because when she finally turned and found him standing in the doorway, she rose so quickly, the brass rule clattered to the stone floor, and she said, "Your Grace, I beg your pardon? I did not," and stopped. She did not have permission to be in the muniment room. She did not have permission to touch the maps. She did not have permission to exist as far as the running of Ashwell Park was concerned anywhere other than the upper corridor, the linen press, and the servants' hall. He had one question. What is wrong with the western boundary? The color rose in her face and then steadied. She looked at him for a moment as though calculating the cost of answering. "The river," she said. "The 1763 survey marks the river's course 60 yards east of where it actually runs. Every subsequent map copied the error. The field lines east of the mill pond are drawn from the wrong starting point, which means the drainage calculations will be 60 yards off in both directions. If the project proceeds on the current maps, you will drain into your own eastern meadow." She said it plainly, not with triumph, not with apology. She said it the way a person states a fact that is simply true. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "Who taught you to read survey maps?" And she said, "My father, your Grace. He was a land agent." The Duke nodded once, retrieved the bound ledger he had come for, and left. He did not speak of what he had found, and he gave no order for the drainage project to proceed. Nora Vane had not expected to be at Ashwell Park at all. She had not expected to be anywhere in particular, which was the condition that 6 months of very bad luck had produced. Her father, Mr. Cetrica. James Vane had been land agent to Sir Edmund Farley of Devizes for 16 years, a position he held with great competence and modest income, until the consumption found him in the autumn of 1814, and did not let go until the following March. He left Nora an education that a woman of her station had no practical use for, a small library of surveying texts and agricultural records, and debts amounting to something near £300 against an estate that was not his to leave. He left her also the particular grief of a woman who had been educated to a position she could not occupy, trained to a standard that could not be publicly demonstrated, and rendered in the eyes of the world simply a land agent's daughter with no prospects. She had kept house for an elderly cousin in Bath for 4 months. Then the cousin died, and her heir arrived from Bristol, and did not want a young woman of uncertain circumstances taking up space in his acquisition. The position at Ashwell Park had come through a friend of a friend, recommended. on the basis that Nora was steady and would not leave within the month. She had been steady. She had been very nearly invisible. She had done her work in the upper corridor, with the kind of quiet efficiency that accumulates into a reputation among housekeepers but does not produce conversation among dukes. She had found the muniment room by accident, carrying a stack of fresh linen down the wrong corridor on a dark October afternoon, and had pushed open the wrong door and found the maps. She had gone back 7 times before the 8th visit, when she had forgotten to be careful. To Nora, the chambermaid who had once learned to read the land, the error in the map was a small, clear problem with a clear solution. It had not occurred to her, not in quite the way it might have, that correcting it would be noticed. Mr. Holt, the butler of Ashwell Park, noticed. He noticed on a Tuesday morning when the Duke summoned him to the library and asked whether the drainage project had begun. Mr. Forblake, Holt confirmed that it had not, and the Duke said he was glad of it, because there was a difficulty with the Western Survey that would need resolving before any work commenced. The butler asked how this difficulty had come to the Duke's attention. The Duke told him. Holt's face did a careful, practiced thing. It arranged itself into an expression of measured gravity while its owner processed what had been said. "The chambermaid," he repeated. "Miss Vane," said the Duke. The distinction appeared to make very little impression on Holt. He was a man of 62, who had managed Ashwell Park through the 5th Duke's final illness, through the transition to the 6th, through 3 complete turnovers of staff in the upper floors, and through any number of situations that had required him to hold the household steady while the world outside it shifted. He had held it steady, in part, by maintaining very clear ideas about which people belonged in which rooms. Miss Vane did not belong in the muniment room. The maps, so far as the butler was concerned, were not Miss Vane's concern. "The surveys are an old matter," he told 2 of the footmen. "Later, the girl has overstepped." He did not say it to Nora directly. He was too practiced for that. He said it in the kitchen corridor, where the sound carried in the manner of a man who is not precisely speaking to anyone. Nora heard it. She heard it and said nothing, and went back to the upper corridor. What she did not know was that the Duke, 3 days later, had sent to the county surveyor's office for the original 1763 survey notes, and had compared them with the map she had annotated. What she did not know was that the county surveyor's notes, when compared with the map's stated measurements, confirmed every correction she had made in the margins. What she did not know was that the Duke had then sent to the original field notes filed with the enclosure commissioners in 1798, and confirmed that those 2 had copied the erroneous starting point, and that she had been, in every particular, correct. She did not know because no one told her. She went on making beds. It was Mrs. Partridge, the housekeeper, who came to her in the 2nd week of November with an expression that suggested she was delivering either very good or very puzzling news, and was not yet certain which. "His Grace wishes to see you," said Mrs. Partridge, "in the library." At 2 o'clock Nora set down the pillowcase she was folding. "Has something been misplaced?" she asked, because that was the only reasonable reason a chambermaid was summoned to the library. "I do not believe so," said Mrs. Partridge, and her expression did not change. The library at Ashwell Park ran the full length of the east wing, and smelled of beeswax and old paper, and the particular cold of a room that had been warm for a long time. There were 12 tall windows and books to the ceiling, on every wall. That was not a window. And in the middle of the room, there was a large table covered with maps. Nora recognized the maps. She recognized them the way one recognizes a mistake one has spent time with. The Duke of Ashwell stood at the far end of the table. He was 34 years old, she knew from the servants' hall, and had been the 6th Duke for 3 years since his father's death. He was said to be very capable, and not at all interested in what anyone thought of his capability. He was tall, with the kind of frame that suggested he spent time on horseback, rather than in drawing rooms. And his face was the kind of face that gave nothing away without deciding to give it. He was looking at her correction. "Miss Vane," he said when she came to a proper stop on the other side of the table. "Your Grace, I have verified your margin notes against the original survey references." She waited. "You are correct," he said. "Every measurement. The eastern meadow would have flooded. She had known she was correct. She had known it with the quiet certainty of a woman who had learned surveying the way other girls learned needlework, from a father who checked her work and then checked it again. She had known it and had not known what to do with knowing it, which was the particular difficulty of her position. "I am glad the meadow will be preserved," she said. Something moved across his face and settled. "My steward has produced a revised drainage proposal based on the corrected coordinates," he said. "I have a question about the mill pond boundary." He indicated the map with one hand. She came around the table and looked. He showed her the discrepancy, a small one, a boundary drawn through what appeared to be open water when the mill pond had clearly at some point been redug slightly to the north. She studied it for a moment. "The pond was enlarged," she said. "You can see the older bank line here. If the new boundary follows the actual water's edge, rather than the historical line, the measurement will need to account for approximately 20 additional yards of northern boundary. Here." She indicated with her finger not quite touching the map. "Yes," he said. She looked up. He was watching her the way he had watched her from the doorway, with an attention that had no obvious practical purpose. "That is what I thought," he said. "Thank you, Miss Vane." She returned to the upper corridor. Holt heard about the library meeting from one of the footmen, and his expression did the careful thing again. "The girl is making herself singular," he said, which was not a compliment, in the form he said it. The winter arrived properly in the first days of December, and with it came Lord Ashwell's sister, Lady Georgiana Frome, and Lady Georgiana's friend, Miss Cecily Cartwright, who was, it was understood throughout the household within 24 hours, a young woman of considerable fortune and considerable expectation. Brought to Ashwell Park in the company of her own mother and a great deal of luggage, for reasons that had nothing to do with the surveying of drainage channels. "Nora," observed Miss Cartwright from the correct distance, which was the distance of a woman who changed the linen and did not form opinions about the guests. Miss Cartwright was 22, with a fair complexion and the kind of self-possession that comes from never having needed to worry about what the correct distance was. She wore a gown of pale gold at dinner the first night, and spoke about the estate with the particular confidence of a woman who has been told it might one day be hers. Lady Georgiana Frome was less interested in pretense. She was the Duke's elder sister by 6 years, and she had a way of observing things that reminded Nora of her father, the quality of attention that does not bother to look where it is supposed to look, and instead looks where it finds something of interest. She found Nora of interest on a Thursday morning in the upper corridor, when Nora was carrying a stack of towels, and Lady Georgiana was walking toward the east stairs and stopped. "You are the one who corrected the maps," she said. Nora considered how to answer this. "I noticed a discrepancy, my lady," she said. "My brother sent to 3 separate archives to confirm you were right." Lady Georgiana studied her with the frank curiosity of a woman who had the social standing to be openly curious. "Where did you learn to survey?" "My father was a land agent, my lady." "Was he?" Lady Georgiana's gaze went to the towels, to the plain gray dress, to the careful way Nora was standing. "And this is how you find yourself." It was not quite a question. It did not need to be. "This is how I find myself," Nora agreed. Lady Georgiana nodded once and walked on. She said nothing else. Yet she looked at Nora twice more that morning, in the way of a woman who is deciding something. If you have ever watched a person of quiet competence be systematically not seen, then you will know what the fortnight before Christmas was like for Nora at Ashwell Park. You will know the exact texture of it, the way it accumulates, not as cruelty, but as the simple weight of ordinary assumption. Miss Cartwright at dinner. Miss Cartwright in the drawing-room with her mother and Lady Georgiana, and the particular geometric arrangement of chairs that made the Duke's eventual choice clear, or intended to make it clear. The music, very prettily played. The conversation, very adeptly managed. Holt moving through it all with the authority of a man who has staged many such arrangements and knows which pieces go where. Nora changed the linen in Miss Cartwright's room on the first Monday of December and did not think about the pale gold gown folded in the trunk at the foot of the bed. She went back to the muniment room on a Tuesday evening. She should not have. She knew she should not have. The muniment room had produced one significant consequence already, and she had no permission to be there, and the sensible course was the upper corridor, and the linen press, and the quiet accumulation of another month's wages toward the eventual reduction of her father's debts. She went. Anyway. The estate maps were still spread on the floor in the order she had left them. No one else had been in to reorganize them, which meant no one else had been in at all. She knelt and looked at the northern boundary line, the one she had not yet had reason to address, and found the small irregularity she had suspected but not confirmed on her last visit. She was there for an hour before she heard the door. She turned. The Duke of Ashwell was standing in the doorway again. This time he was holding a lantern, because it was past 6 o'clock and the December dark had come in early. The light made his face a study in planes and shadow, and he looked at her for a moment with the careful expression of a man who is deciding whether to say something that he has been not saying for some time. "The northern boundary," he said. "There is a problem with it," Nora said. She could feel the color in her face. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I had no right to come in here, and I will go." "What is the problem with the northern boundary?" She looked at him. She looked at the map. She sat back on her heels and said, "The lane to Ashby Village is marked 15 feet south of its actual position. It matters because the right-of-way would be compromised if anyone ever built on the verge, and someone has recently proposed to build a cottage on the northern parcel. If the cottage goes up according to the current map, it will be partially inside the right-of-way." A pause. "The cottage was approved last week," he said. "I know," she said, and then stopped, because she had heard the approval discussed in the kitchen corridor, and she was not supposed to be listening to anything discussed in the kitchen corridor. She was supposed to be invisible and competent and unobtrusive. He came into the room and set the lantern on the table and looked at the map. She looked at it too because it was safer than looking at him. "Show me," he said. She showed him. His face was close to hers over the map, closer than it had been in the library, because the muniment room was smaller and the maps were on the floor, and they were both kneeling beside them. She could see the line of his jaw in the lantern light, and she did not look at it. She finished explaining and sat back. He said nothing for a moment. "Miss Vane," he said. He did not say it the way he said it at the library, as the formal opening to a professional exchange. He said it with a quality she had no precise name for, something that existed between attention and recognition. She looked up. "How did your father die?" he asked. The question was unexpected enough that she answered it without calculation. "Consumption," she said. "Last spring." He nodded. He was looking at the map, but the attention was not on the map. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said. "Fever, very sudden. 1 week she was well, and the following week she was not." He was still looking at the map. "I had been away in Scotland on a land matter for 10 days. By the time I returned, there was nothing to be done." He said it without dramatic weight. He said it the way he said everything, with a level plainness that was not cold, but was very controlled. "I have not been able to sit in the music room since," he said. She played very well. The lantern flickered. Outside, the frost was forming on the north windows. "I am sorry," Nora said. She meant it simply and completely. He looked at her then, and what was on his face was not the controlled blankness. It was something that had not had an occasion for expression in 3 years, and was not sure how to conduct itself. "The cottage will be stopped," he said. "The boundary will be surveyed and the map corrected." He rose and retrieved the lantern. "Miss Vane," he said from the doorway, "you have permission to use this room." She heard his steps down the long corridor and sat in the dark for a while, her hand resting on the edge of the map. What happened in the 2 weeks before Christmas happened quietly, the way things do when neither person is ready to name them. He came to the muniment room on 4 separate evenings. She was there on 3 of those evenings, and the 4th time she was not. But she found the following morning that the Northern Survey had been unrolled, and a note in a very precise hand had been left on the table. The boundary of the Ashby Lane measured and marked. He had done it himself. She did not know what to do with this. She folded the note and put it in the pocket of her grey dress and went to change the linen. Lady Georgiana found her in the gallery on a Wednesday morning and said, without preamble, "He has not played the pianoforte since Catherine died, but last evening I heard him try a few bars and stop. That has not happened in 3 years." Nora was adjusting the frame of a minor portrait that hung slightly crooked. "I could not say what that signifies, my lady," she said. "I could," said Lady Georgiana. The butler noticed something in the 4th week. He noticed it, the way he noticed most things, through the accumulation of small details that did not individually add up to anything but collectively produced a conclusion he did not like. He came to Nora in the corridor on the Thursday before Christmas. "The Duke's guests are present for the season," he said. "He will have particular requirements. It would be best if you confined yourself to the duties for which you were engaged." It was said with courtesy. It was said with precision. It arrived with the specific weight of a statement that is technically about one thing, and actually about something else entirely. Nora looked at him. She was a woman who had learned to be careful with her face, and she was careful now. "I understand, Holt," she said. That evening she did not go to the muniment room, nor the next evening. On the Saturday morning she was in the upper corridor, when she heard voices below in the entrance hall. Miss Cartwright's mother had brought a solicitor from Bath. She learned from one of the other maids a quiet and rapid exchange in the linen press. A marriage settlement was to be discussed. Nothing was finalized, nothing was confirmed, but settlements were not discussed without a purpose. And the purpose was becoming clear to everyone in the household who was paying attention. Holt was in the hall when she came downstairs with the fresh towels. "The chambermaid," he said. Not to her. He said it to one of the footmen in a tone that put a particular frame around the word, a frame that was composed of all the distance between what she was and what the hall required. He said it without malice, which was worse than if he had said it with malice, because it meant he simply did not see her as the sort of person about whom malice was necessary. Nora went on to the east corridor. She was there when Lady Georgiana came out of the drawing-room with the particular expression of a woman who has been in an airless room for too long. "Miss Vane," she said, "my lady." Lady Georgiana looked at her for a moment. "My brother is a stubborn man," she said, "and a grief-stricken one. He has mistaken the two for the same thing, which is the characteristic error of stubborn, grief-stricken men." She looked past Nora down the corridor. "He does not know how to choose a thing he was not expecting to want." She walked on. The Christmas week arrived, and with it a large dinner. 34 covers in the long dining room, candles from one end to the other, and a fire in the great hearth that made the room feel warmer than it was. Nora served as auxiliary staff for the occasion, carrying things and disappearing between courses with the efficiency that had made her invisible for 6 weeks. It was during the second remove that the butler's voice carried from the head of the sideboard to the corner of the room where 2 of the senior footmen were standing. "She is simply a chambermaid who found herself in a room she should not have entered," he said. He was speaking of the survey, she understood. Someone had asked about it. The question had circulated among the guests because Lady Georgiana had mentioned the corrected maps at some point in the week, and it had become a conversational curiosity. The questions she has raised have been attended to by the proper authorities. It was a matter of no great significance. The dining room was not large enough for that to go unheard. Edmund was at the far end of the table. He heard it. She saw him hear it, the very small stillness that crossed his face, the deliberate quality with which he set down his glass. He did not look at her. He looked at the candle flame directly in front of him, and said nothing. She went to the kitchen corridor with the empty serving dish, and stood there for a moment in the dark. She had known the position she was in. She had always known it. She had known it when her father died, when the cousin's heir arrived from Bristol, when the agency placed her at Ashwell Park as a chambermaid, because a chambermaid was what the moment required. She was a land agent's daughter. With a surveyor's education and 1,200 acres of estate knowledge, she had acquired in a room she had never been given permission to enter, and she was 26 years old. And the Duke's solicitors were in the west drawing room with a marriage settlement for a woman who wore pale gold and had never needed to worry about permission. She put the dish down and walked to the muniment room. She did not know why precisely. The maps were there, and the maps were the thing that was hers, in the way that nothing else in Ashwell Park was hers. She knelt on the floor beside the Western Survey and put her hand flat on the vellum over the correction she had made in the margins, and stayed there until she could breathe properly. The door opened. She did not turn around. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace." She stayed where she was for a moment, and then stood and faced him, because there was no other reasonable thing to do. "Forgive me. I know I should return to the dining room." He had not come from the dining room. He was still in evening dress, but he had not sent a footman. He had come himself, which meant he had left his own table. "You heard what Holt said," he said. "Yes." "It was not accurate." "Your Grace," she said carefully, "it was not inaccurate in any way that matters. I am a chambermaid. The surveys have been attended to. The matter is resolved." "The matter," he said, "is not resolved." He came into the room. He did not come all the way across it, but far enough that the door swung partway closed behind him, and the lantern on the table was between them, and she could see his face clearly. "I have been very careful," he said, "to keep the appropriate distance. I have been careful because the position here is not equal, and I have not wished to put you in the position of—" He stopped. He looked at the map. He looked at her. "Catherine died, and I thought I understood what that meant, which was that I understood how to be without that particular kind of attention. I understood it so well for 3 years that I did not notice when I no longer understood it." She did not speak. "I came to the muniment room the first time for a ledger," he said. "I came the second time because you were there. The frost was on the north windows. The lantern made its small, steady light. I am a chambermaid," she said. It was not refusal. It was the fact that was plainest, that existed in the most obvious way. "Your father was a land agent," he said. "He taught you to read a survey map, and to verify a measurement, and to state a correction plainly to a man who had come in expecting to be unquestioned. You have done it 3 times. You saved my eastern meadow the right-of-way to Ashby Village, and a cottage that would have gone up in the wrong place. No man in my employ has done all 3 in 3 years. She looked at the map. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I want to ask it plainly, because I do not know another way to ask it." "Ask it," she said. "Will you stay at Ashwell Park?" he said in a capacity other than this one. She looked at him. He said, "I want to choose you. I am asking if you will permit me to choose you." 12 words. 12 words in a level voice in the lantern-lit muniment room of a house that was not hers and had never been. She thought of her father's hand on her shoulder, bent over a survey map at a kitchen table, devises. She thought of the morning she had found the western boundary error, and sat for a long moment with the knowledge of it, not knowing what to do, with a thing that was true and could not be said. She thought of the note left on the table in a precise hand, the boundary of the Ashby Lane measured and marked, and what it had taken for a man of his particular careful reserve to cross a room at night with a measuring rule. "Yes," she said. He crossed the room and took her hand. He did not kiss it. He held it with a careful pressure, the way a person holds a thing they intend to keep. Outside the muniment room, the household went on. The dinner went on. Holt moved between the sideboard and the kitchen corridor, with the efficient authority of 20 years. Miss Cartwright's mother sat over the remains of the third remove and spoke to the solicitor in a low voice about terms that were about to become unnecessary. Lady Georgiana, who had been watching the door to the dining room for 20 minutes, permitted herself one small, quiet expression of satisfaction, and then returned her attention to the soup. What followed in the next days was not a dramatic reversal in any public arena. It was something quieter and more specific than that. On the morning of the 27th of December, the Duke of Ashwell summoned the butler to the library. He told Holt that Miss Vane would be taking a new position in the household as a state records assistant, with full access to the muniment room and the survey archive. He said this in the library in the presence of his steward and his solicitor, Mr. Clement, who had arrived from Bath not for a marriage settlement but for the revision of the estate records. Holt's face did the careful thing. "The chambermaid," he said. "Miss Vane," said the Duke, in precisely the tone he had used in the first exchange, and in precisely the tone he had used in the second. It landed differently the third time. It landed with the weight of a third statement, which is always heavier than a first or a second. The butler was not a cruel man, and not ultimately an unperceptive one. He looked at Mr. Clement, who was reviewing documents. He looked at the Duke, whose face was giving away only what it had decided to give away, which today included a certain steady quality that had not been there 3 weeks ago. He looked at the door. "Yes, Your Grace," he said. In the drawing-room, Miss Cartwright's mother had received a note from Lady Georgiana that was pleasant and absolutely clear. Lady Georgiana's brother had made his intentions known regarding the estate's future arrangements. She trusted Mrs. Cartwright, and Miss Cartwright had enjoyed their Christmas visit, and she would be delighted to be of service in future in any capacity that did not involve the estate's immediate domestic arrangements. A carriage had been arranged for 11 o'clock, should they prefer to begin the journey to Bath before the afternoon. Miss Cartwright read this in the window seat with the pale gold gown folded in her lap. She was 22 and had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice, and she had believed it with the genuine confidence of a woman whose category had always worked. She looked at the pale gold gown. Then she folded it back into the trunk and asked the maid to call for the carriage. The muniment room was quiet that afternoon. Nora was at the table with the Northern Survey unrolled before her, making the formal corrections in the margin that would go into the estate record. Clement sat across from her with a ledger, noting each correction as she stated it. The Duke stood at the window with his back to the room, looking out at the frost on the north lawn, and every 10 minutes or so he turned and looked at her as though confirming something. She finished the northern boundary correction and moved on to the mill pond survey. The estate records were a significant undertaking. She knew this already, had known it from the first map she had spread on the floor. But the full scope of the problem was becoming clear, as Clement opened ledger after ledger, and she moved from survey to survey. 60 years of accumulated error, some of it small, some of it significant. 60 years of maps copied from maps copied from maps, each generation inheriting the mistakes of the last, without anyone having the training to recognize what was wrong. She did not say this aloud. She said it with the small, quiet way she kept moving. From survey to survey, correction to correction, the brass rule, and the pencil doing the work. At some point, Clement had gone. At some point, the winter light through the north windows had begun to change. The Duke came to the table and stood across from her. "There is a great deal to do," she said. "Yes," he said. He was looking at her, not at the map. "It will take some time." "I am aware." She looked up. He was almost smiling. It was a very restrained expression, contained in the particular way his face contained things, but it was there, and it had a warmth in it that she had not seen before in his face. The warmth of a thing finally permitted. "You will need assistance," he said. "Someone who can ride the boundaries when the weather allows." "That would help considerably," she said. "I know the northern boundary well," he said. "I measured it myself 2 weeks ago." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "You left a note." The almost smile became something slightly more than an almost smile. He turned to look at the window. The frost was heavy on the glass. Now the afternoon light going blue in the way of a December evening in the English countryside. The sky above the north lawn the color of pewter, and somewhere in the east wing, past the corridor and the library and the music room, a piano had begun to play. Someone had sat down at the piano in the music room. It played 3 bars and stopped. Then it played 4 more. The Duke stood very still and listened. Then he looked at Nora, and something in his face completed itself, some long-held tension, easing the way a drawn bow eases when the arrow is finally released. "Come," he said. It was a command in the form of a command, and an invitation in the form of a command, and something else in the form of a command that she had learned by now to hear correctly. "The maps will wait until morning." She set down the pencil and the rule. She rolled the survey carefully and secured it with the cord. She did it without hurrying. They walked out of the muniment room and down the long corridor toward the music room, and when they reached the door, Lady Georgiana was inside at the pianoforte, playing as quietly as she could manage, and she looked up when they came in, and then looked down again, her expression composed, her fingers finding the next phrase. The fire in the music room was high. The frost was on the windows here too, and through the glass, the grounds of Ashwell Park were beginning to disappear into the early dark. The north lawn and the east meadow, the lane to Ashby Village and the mill pond, and the 1,200 acres that Nora now knew better than anyone living, better than the steward, better than the butler of 20 years, better than the late 5th Duke who had commissioned the original surveys without checking the measurements. She stood beside the window and looked out at the land in the dark. And Edmund stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of exactly where he was. Lady Georgiana played on. Later, when the household had quieted, and the fires had been banked for the night and the solicitor's papers were stacked neatly in the library for the morning, Nora went back to the muniment room one last time. She did not go for the maps. She went because she had left her father's brass rule on the table, the one she had carried from Devizes through Bath through 6 months of displacement, the one she had set down on the edge of the vellum the morning the frost came and the Duke had stood in the doorway and asked what was wrong with the western boundary. She picked it up and held it for a moment. The rule was scratched from use, worn at one end, where her father had gripped it, warm from the room. She turned it in her hands. She put it in her pocket. The muniment room was dark, and the maps were rolled and secured, and the corrections were made, and the frost was hard on the north windows, and somewhere down the corridor a piano was playing again, 3 bars and 4 bars and 5, and this time it did not stop.